Welcome committee members, liaisons, and members of the public to the Legal Services Trust Fund Rules Committee meeting. Thank you for joining us. We are using Zoom with the goal to foster a more inclusive environment and effective meeting. If you would like to comment during the meeting, please use the raise hand feature. Please utilize this tool to virtually indicate that you would like to speak in order to help the chair facilitate the discussion. A friendly reminder, this is a video conference. Per Bagley County requirements, all cameras must be kept on during the duration of the meeting. If you are unable to have your camera on, you must indicate a reason for your non-appearance during the meeting. Please be aware of the surroundings behind you. All committee meetings will be recorded and posted to the State Bar's website. Zoom captioning is available. To enable, select live transcript at the bottom of your screen, then select Enable Transcript. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, Erica, do you want to call roll for us? Good morning, Dwan.
Yes, happy to do that. Sorry, my roll call sheet's not loading right now. Okay, there it is. Okay, Blakemore,
Present.
Al-Saraf, Connolly,
Here.
Wong, Mahoney, Sandville,
Here.
Vargas. Okay, and we have a quorum, and I'll go through liaisons and then State Bar staff. Selena Copeland,
Present.
Melanie Snyder, Vaughn Wing.
Here.
Vaughn's here, yeah. I see Raul as well. Great, thank you.
Perfect. I think let's see if well, let's just do, I thought we might just start with introductions. We did some of those at our full commission meeting, but since this is our first committee meeting of the year, I thought it might be helpful if we just introduced ourselves and said how long we've been on the commission, what our appointment status is, and meaning who appointed us, and any fun fact, as Erica would say, that you want to share about yourself. And we probably won't remember what you said a week ago, so if you repeat it, that's fine too. So I'll just start and say I'm Catherine Blakemore. I was a legal aid lawyer for my entire legal career, and I retired from Disability Rights California about 5 years ago. And I am currently a Senate appointee to the committee. And a fun fact is this year in September, I'm hoping to go to Mallorca, Spain. So I'm really looking forward to that. So with that, Erica, you want to go next?
Sure. I feel like this is my penalty for suggesting fun facts. So I am Erica Connolly. I've been on the commission since 2019. I think I'm a board of trustees appointee, but Dwan or someone on the staff can correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, you're state bar. Yeah.
Thanks. And I've been on the rules committee for several years now. And let's see, what's a fun fact? I won a big order motion yesterday, so that's very exciting. So I'm kind of riding that high. So
that's great.
Thank you. So I don't know if it's fun, but it's fun for me because I was excited about it.
Always fun to win a big motion. It's exciting after all that hard work. Okay, Jonathan.
Hi, Jonathan Sandville, Senior Fellow with the Institute for Nonprofit Practice, and I'm also a lecturer at USC. I came to the commission in 2023, the fall of 2023. So I guess I'm still somewhat new, still connecting with people and meeting people and learning and growing. A fun fact, I just taught a class at USC online and it ended at noon and I jumped on this call. But no, a real fun fact, I'm probably the orchid whisperer. So I'm good at growing orchids and regrowing them and having them rebloom. So that's my fun fact.
That's great. I was off to buy an orchid for my house, so maybe I should get some advice from you. Okay, Javier.
Hi, everyone. My name is Xavier, he, him. I am a public member on the commission. I've been here for about 2 years. My background is more on the business side. I've spent 12 plus years working in corporate finance, government, nonprofit, and across both coasts. So just kind of like to dip my feet in a lot of things that I don't know much about. And I guess that's one of the themes that brought me into wanting to be engaged in this commission. Fun fact about me. Well, I mentioned our 3.5-year-old, which we have a young kid. A lot of our lives revolve around him. But this coming weekend, so tomorrow, we're going to be doing a quick 1.5-day trip out to the mountains to have him play in snow for the first time. So he conceptually is very excited. Once everything is cold and wet, he will probably continue to be excited, but us less so. So that's what we're doing this weekend.
Have a fun trip. It's always exciting when kids experience something new. Since we're a small group, I thought I'd invite the staff to just introduce themselves. We have amazing staff that support this committee. So, Dwan, you want to lead off and then
Yeah, so you all know me, Dwan Wing, Program Director in the office. And, this committee means a lot to me because I used to be the committee coordinator, handing over the reins to Erica, who you all know is phenomenal. Fun fact, so I'll follow up from, so I had the swimming lesson. I'm not afraid of the water. So the instructor was like, usually people that come later in life, it's because of fear of water. So I can go down and I can hold my breath. I can float a little bit. The kicking is very hard. And the instructor said, actually, when you learn as adult, the kicking is always like the hard, it just, for whatever reason, like it's hard to, I can kick, but I can't propel myself. So that's where I'm at.
That's great though. We love
It was fun. It was a lot of fun.
That's great. Good for you. Learning something new. Erica?
Hi, everybody. Erica Carroll. I'm a lead program analyst with the Office of Access and Inclusion and the committee coordinator this year for rules. Been with the State Bar about 5 years. And trying to think of a fun fact these days. I'm currently reading a book about Stoicism. It's called The Practicing Stoic, and it's been pretty, I'm really just kind of setting out, but it's been pretty engaging so far.
Good recommendation. I always love a book recommendation. Raul.
Hello, my name is Raul Duran. I'm Assistant General Counsel in the Office of General Counsel, and I've been with the bar for about 3 years now. And along with Brady Dewar, provide support to the work of the Legal Services Trust Fund Commission. And fun fact, the one that I'm thinking about right now is that I have an adorable 3-year-old corgi named Tiramisu. But the not so fun fact is he likes to bark a lot. So I apologize in advance if you hear him barking during today's meeting.
And does he like to eat tiramisu or that
No, we have not met him.
seems like maybe a bad idea for dogs?
Yeah.
Great. Selena.
I'll pick up on the themes of a couple of folks. Selena Copeland, she, her pronouns. I'm a liaison. I've been going to commission meetings since probably 2009 or so. And I am a cat person, but early in the pandemic, I read a book called like How to Have Fun. And it recommended that, having a dog could be fun for adults. Throwing a ball with a dog could be fun. So we rescued a dog. It's my first dog as an adult. And now we foster dogs too. So like Raul, you will probably see dogs and cats on my video at some point because they're all near me right now.
That's great. Okay, perfect. Well, thanks everyone for doing that. I just think it's nice to get acquainted with everyone, and I look forward to a really engaging meeting. I think we're going to turn to public comment if there is any.
No one has their hand raised.
Okay, thanks for letting us know. Did you want to introduce yourself at all, Kimberly?
Oh, okay. Kim Wormsley, Office of Access and Inclusion Program Specialist. I've been with the bar for 24 years, and I'm kind of opposite of Dwan. When I started to had to take swimming in middle school was when junior high school is when I found out I was allergic to chlorine, so that only lasted 1 week, and then I got uh, kicked out of swimming class and had to take something else for the rest of the quarter.
There are fresh saltwater pools now. You can try again. No chlorine. That's a great pickup. Hey, Brady, we were just introducing ourselves.
Yes, I saw most of those. My name is Brady Dewar. I am also an assistant general counsel in the Office of General Counsel. Work with Raul supporting the commission. And was it any fun fact?
Anyone you want.
Oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. I'm gonna sound so. We are going skiing this weekend. Taking my son and daughter, and they've gone a few times. And yeah, just be a nice weekend outside. Looking forward to it.
That will be great. It should be a nice weekend, actually. All right, perfect. I think we have finished introductions. Thank you, everybody who did that, joined at the end. And we don't have any public comment, it appears, which means that my recollection, Erica, is there's no staff report, right?
Correct.
Okay, so we will skip that on the agenda, which takes us to the open session minutes from November 6th. Erica, anything to say about those?
Nope, no changes or edits.
And does anybody who have any comments or questions about the minutes? Members? Seems I'm looking, shaking heads. Okay, if not, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
No motion.
Thank you,
I'll-
Jonathan, and
Second, Erica.
thank you. And just as a reminder, if you were not at the last meeting, you are still able to vote in favor of the minutes, just as an affirmation that you support the colleagues who were there and the people that took the minutes. So, okay, with that motion and second, want to do the roll call, Erica? Or Kimberly, whoever's doing it?
Yeah, I'll take it. Thank you. Alsaroff, Connolly,
Yes.
Wong, Mahoney, Sandville,
Yes.
Vargas,
Yes.
Blakemore.
Yes.
4 yeses, no nos. The motion passes.
Terrific. We now have a presentation, I think from Raul or maybe both Raul and Brady, about the real property and tangible personal property, which is something that will become a rule. You should have received, I think late yesterday, a copy of a memo that I think they're going to walk us through, which will be great. And just observing there's some thoughtful discussion questions at the end of that. So I think we will turn it over to you to go through that.
Great. Yeah, just give me a second to get.
Yeah, and this is informational. There's not a proposed rule. It's to ask questions. And then there'll be a subsequent rule about it.
That's right. I would say I think this is sort of the start of discussion on this. I think you'll see that there's sort of a lot of various ways that we can move forward with this as a policy question, and so this is sort of to sort of start that conversation, and then from there we can come back with, I think, a more detailed proposal about how we would implement it.
I'll just give a little background that this particular topic, we asked OGC to provide us the research on it because it was so technical and we didn't have the expertise in our office to do it.
That's great. Seems like they've given it a lot of thought too. So we appreciated the information and the discussion of options about things.
Great. Yes, so I'll be presenting on the item 3.1 on the agenda regarding the purchase of real property. So the purpose of this presentation, as I sort of previewed, is to lay out analysis of the State Bar's existing policy governing the use of grant funds for the purchase of real property. But at this point, we haven't gotten sort of staff input yet on sort of the practical realities of the existing policy or alternatives. But it should be useful to sort of get a sense of what we currently have in place and what are some of the alternatives, and also sort of what are the policy decisions behind the way the policy currently looks like. And then we can come back later with a proposal for a revised policy. So as background, the current policy was adopted in 1986. I understand that it has not really been in use much in recent years, and so we haven't been approving the purchase of real property. But despite that, this is the policy that's currently in place. So I plan to walk through the current policy with the caveat that it's primarily a summary of the policy as described, and given the absence of sort of the actual implementation of the policy, that there could still be a lot of open questions about how it would operate in all situations. And then I plan to walk through a comparison of the guidelines of the Legal Services Corporation to see how they approve the purchase of real property with grant funds. And I think you'll see that there's definitely choices made about how we want to sort of restrict or permit the use of such funds for such purchases, and that there's another way to do it based on the model of the Legal Services Corporation. And then at the end, and as you'll have seen in the memo too, I have some specific suggestions for things to consider about what we want in a policy going forward. But that list is not meant to be exhaustive, and we are free to include additional considerations.
Thanks. And I just wanted to note Tammy Mahoney has joined us, so just welcoming her to the meeting.
Thank you, Catherine. I didn't want to interrupt. Thank you.
All right, so big picture, the policy requires that any purchase of real property using grant funds must receive prior approval from the commission. So in terms of what falls within the scope of the policy, it depends on the definition of an expenditure for real property. Our policy defines it as an expenditure for costs associated with the purchase of real property, and then goes on to list sort of a laundry list of various legal forms that the purchase of real property could take. That includes down payments, closing costs, debt service payments, non-refundable deposits, etc. The list is much longer in the policy itself. But I would say that this broad definition of what serves as a purchase of real property has two functions. It sort of makes sure that we have a broad scope and that all expenditures sort of might be within what is considered permissible, but at the same time requires that they have prior approval. So by having a broad definition, things that might not normally be considered real purchase of real property still have to come to the commission for prior approval.
Oh, do you want to go through all of this, or do you want questions as we're going through?
Maybe be easier to reserve questions for the end unless there's something pressing.
No problem. I'm helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, this is okay. And then the policy has because purchases require prior approval, there's limited exemptions from that approval process. And those are that we exempt anything from prior approval if it does not exceed the lesser of $5,000 or 5% of grant funds. Essentially a de minimis exemption below which the commission is not going to get involved in scrutinizing whether the purchase is appropriate or not. And then there's also an exemption for debt service payments for debt that's greater than 5 years old. I'll revisit the reason for this 5-year exemption as it relates to the life of the state bar security interest in the purchased property. So I think that the reason for this exemption will become clearer. So the policy also imposes certain restrictions before it will approve, before the commission can approve the purchase of real property. I view these restrictions as aimed at protecting the overall purpose of the use of IALTA and EAF funds generally, and that it's just to ensure that the use of these funds is ultimately benefiting the provision of legal services to the indigent. So one of those limitations is that the purchase must lead to lower overall cost to the grantee or provide other benefits. So according to the policy, other benefits might include that the purchase provides access to a unique space that is uniquely benefits the provision of legal services. Relatedly, the property cannot be overpriced. The policy explicitly states that the purchased property cannot be priced in excess of the fair market value of a similar property. This just seems to me to protect sort of funds generally, that we're not permitting the purchase of like a bad investment, essentially, of grant funds. And the policy also includes the restriction that the property cannot be purchased to jointly for lease to others, and it cannot be used by programs that are not qualified to receive funds. The idea here, again, I think, is to marry the use of such funds for the purchase of real property to something that is going to directly benefit the provision of legal services to the indigent. And finally, the policy states that the commission has the right to deny any purchase, absent reference to one of these specific limitations, if it believes that denying the purchase is consistent with the goals of IALTA and EAF funds. As far as the actual procedure required, a grantee has to first submit a proposal for an expenditure for the purchase of real property with grant funds in a proposed budget or in an amended or supplemental budget. That proposal must be accompanied by a set of information that permits the state bar to perform sort of basic diligence on the purchase. So that includes items you might expect, such as the title report, a description of the property, and contemplated uses, and the occupancy costs of the grantee of the property, including a comparison of that to their costs were they simply to lease a similar property. These, together with sort of being able to evaluate the overall merit of purchasing the property, it goes towards supporting the state bar's review that the purchase is consistent with the limitations outlined previously. And if according to the policy, if the purchase would indeed exceed the fair market value, it might still be approved, but the grantee would need to submit documentation to demonstrate why there are special criteria that nonetheless support the purchase, such as access to a unique space. So as part of the policy, the state bar obtains a security interest because it's important to us to ensure that the proceeds of any disposition of the property are put back to permissible uses. So the approval of the purchase will only be given if the grantee can ensure that the proceeds that are attributed to actual grant funds spent in the purchase, if that property is ultimately sold, those proceeds will only be used for providing legal services to the indigent. To ensure this, the policy envisions that the grantee will provide a deed of trust to the state bar, and that deed of trust grants the state bar a security interest in the property only for the length of the amortization period. The amortization period is the time during which the state bar retains an interest in the purchased property, after which that security interest sunsets and restrictions on the use of proceeds from a disposition are lifted. So the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the amortization period and what I think the sort of, perhaps what the policy sort of thinking was behind adoption of an amortization period. But I just want to clarify a bit about sort of the portion of proceeds that have to go toward legal services on disposition. If we were to approve, let's say, $10,000 in grant fund for the purchase of property, upon disposition, $10,000 of the proceeds have to go back to legal services. And as you'll see later on in this presentation, the Legal Services Corporation takes a different approach. Okay, so according to the policy, the commission can designate the length of the amortization period in its discretion. The policy, sort of without providing necessarily the clearest guidelines as to why the commission might pick one of these options over another, provides that that period might be 5 years, or the amount of time it would take before the aggregate cost of the purchasing of the property falls below the aggregate cost had the grantee leased a similar property, or some other period as appropriate. So it's just to illustrate that second option. I understand that to mean that, for example, if over the course of 3 years, a grantee would have spent $250,000 in leasing a property, if the grantee instead purchases a property in over 3 years, their total occupancy costs are less than $250,000, and they hit only like $245,000. In that third year, the restriction on proceeds from the disposition of the property are lifted, and the amortization period is shortened. I just want to add sort of that a comment that while this there I think might be a policy reason behind this, I do think that this approach is likely to involve a more significant administrative burden for the purposes of from staff, because we would have to assess when we have reached that point and have an additional review to make sure that it's accurate. So I think that, but I do think that second choice is about limiting the state bar's interest once the grantee has recognized a financial benefit. It also, I think, is a way of not imposing an additional restriction on grantees who have effectively, improved their cost efficiency. We don't want them to say, oh, you should have continued as a tenant, but now that you are more efficient with your funds, we're still going to impose an additional restriction on you based on the use of those funds. So that's what I think is going on here. Okay. So sorry, that's big picture, the sort of the framework of our existing policy. And so I want to dive in a bit into the federal analog, which is the guidelines that the Legal Services Corporation uses for approving the purchase of real property with their grant funds. The main difference, and I think that it informs a lot of the reasons behind why their guidelines are different than ours, is that the Legal Services Corporation retains a perpetual interest in property purchase with their grant funds. So unlike our amortization period, which so at a certain point we no longer care essentially what the grantee does with the property, the Legal Services Corporation, even if that property is disposed of 10 or 20 years after, is still interested in ensuring that those grant funds go back toward providing legal services to the indigent. So they define, unlike the laundry list approach of our policy, they simply say the purchase of real property is buying real estate with LLC funds. And it's sort of left to sort of interpretation of what types of purchases fall within the scope of that. They also don't have any kind of exemptions for what types of purchases require prior approval. So there's no de minimis threshold like we have in the state bar's policy. I will note, though, that that generally debt services payments are not viewed as the purchase of real property, and rather than subjecting them to prior approval, instead it's just that they're allowed to the extent that they're equivalent to the amount of rent a grantee would have paid for a similar property. So it sort of just exempts it fully from consideration of this approach. All right, so like the state bar's policy, the grantee is required to use the property purchased to deliver legal services. And unlike the state bar, they require an annual accounting of grant funds used to pay for the property. That annual accounting also includes any capital expenditures, which I think makes more sense in the context of a policy where they retain a perpetual interest in the property. And unlike the state bar, they don't have restrictions on the use of the property. So if they want to buy property, but a program that isn't qualifying, use another portion of the property, that's permissible, and there's no outright prohibition. So they're not required to use the full space. And also, though our policy says that there must be a benefit to purchasing the property over leasing, be that by a unique space or through sort of realized cost reductions. They don't have that as an explicit requirement. It's simply a consideration when the LLC is deciding whether or not to approve that kind of purchase. Same for the fair market value of the property. There's no outright prohibition that the cost be lower than the fair market value, the same or lower than the fair market value of the property. So in terms of the purchase approval procedure for the LLC, their grantee must submit a statement of need, which must include an informal market survey of 3 equivalent properties and a comparison of their average annual costs of owning versus of leasing. So again, it's a consideration, but not an explicit requirement that it be a cost savings. But the LLC also expressly considers certain factors that are not at all mentioned in our policy. One is that consideration is given to whether the purchased property provides ready access to public transportation. They also evaluate whether the purchase is consistent with trends in the staffing needs of the grantee, and whether the costs associated with the purchase are consistent with the funding needs. They also evaluate whether the property is in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act. Yeah, again, so this is something that we don't consider. Again, some of these I do think seem valuable, but just want to give the context again. Additional criteria do add to probably the administrative burden to overseeing this type of purchase. All right, so here's where the big difference is. So unlike the state bar, the LLC's interest does not lapse and lasts until disposition of the property. So as such, the grantee is required to track any capital improvements and record the interest in the property. They're also required to maintain insurance and to insure the property. Sorry, to maintain the property and have insurance. And they're also not allowed to encumber the property or dispose of it without the LLC's prior approval. So the state bar does not have in its policy any requirement of obtaining prior approval from the state bar before disposing of a property or of encumbering it. The only restriction is on the use of proceeds from that disposition. So another important difference from the state bar's approach is that the legal services corporation interest might grow over time with the growth of the fair market value of the property. So hence the need for tracking capital improvements. This seems to me consistent with a perpetual interest in a property as a disposition many years after the purchase could reflect a significant depreciation in value of the initial grant funds used for the purchase. And so what a grantee is allowed to do in terms of how it disposes of the property depends on whether it's doing so during an existing grant period or whether all grant periods have expired. If during a grant period, they have to use a proportionate share of the proceeds attributable to LLC funds used for the purchase they have to use that portion consistent with the requirement of LLC funds generally. So, you know, for if $100,000 of grant funds was spent upon the purchase and upon disposition, the property has appreciated 100%. Upon disposition, it would be double that. It would be 200K. That would have to go back to LLC uses. Whereas the state bar's policy doesn't take into account any appreciation in the fair market value of the purchased property. And then if disposition occurs after a grant period, then they can either sell it or they can buy out the LLC's share of the property. The Legal Services Corporation's guidelines also discuss that they can transfer the property to another grantee. I'm not sure how like common that would be. You know, it's like they have a larger jurisdiction, so maybe that's something that's more of a common occurrence, but it's not addressed in the state bar's policy. So yeah, that's sort of big picture, the state bar's current policy and the Legal Service Corporation's policy. Just to highlight some considerations that I think would be useful for discussion is we should consider whether we want to permit debt service payments and continue to consider them real property purchases, or to treat them the way the Legal Service Corporation does and just consider the amount equivalent to the lease of a similar property as allowable, and that's it. Whether we want to reevaluate the existence of a de minimis exemption or increase that amount. So this is something I particularly wanted to add, which is right now it's not super clear in the state bar's policy, but by virtue of retaining a security interest in the purchased property, the primary enforcement mechanism for the state bar would be to force a sale. And I think that for many of our grantees, or you imagine any grantee, the forced sale of a property would be a significant sanction. And so I just want to posit that maybe additional consideration should be given to what types of grantees would be eligible for this if we move forward with this approach, to sort of reduce the likelihood that we have to resort to that sanction. For example, you know, a long history of compliance with all our rules. Again, so do we want the amortization period to remain 5 years, or would we rather an approach like the Legal Services Corporations where we take a perpetual interest? How do we want to maintain the requirement that the property not exceed the fair market value, or can we just make that a consideration? Should we establish a cap under which capital expenditures don't require approval? So we don't address capital expenditures at all in our policy. The Legal Services Corporation allows $25,000 under which a grantee can spend grant funds to improve a property and don't have to get prior approval over that amount they do. That's another consideration is whether we should require an annual accounting. We may have less of a need for that or interest in that if we have a short amortization period and our interest doesn't last beyond a few years. This might be more important if we retain a longer interest. And then should we consider additional criteria like the LLC does, such as access to public transportation, ADA compliant, and trends in their staffing and program needs?
Anything else before we see if people have questions?
I think I just wanted to jump in, Catherine, to maybe
Sure.
provide a little more context for kind of historically, for folks who haven't been on the committee or the commission as long, in terms of the application of these guidelines in the past few years. So as Raul mentioned, there was a number of years that we hadn't really been using the guidelines, but starting in 2020, I believe, when that was the first year, there was really a very significant increase in IOLTA. There had been more reason to kind of highlight these guidelines for grantees and encourage them to perhaps, use some of their grant award towards these types of purchases. So I would say in 2020 was the first instance in recent memory where grantees were budgeting for these types of purchases. At that time, I don't remember the exact number. It was a handful of grantees, let's say maybe between 5 and 8, 5 and 7, that requested to use grant funds. I would say the majority of them were for debt service payments, and in some instances, it was for an existing property. It wasn't necessarily for a new building that they were looking to purchase. And the reason that we thought it was important to revisit this now is, as everybody knows, with increasing grant awards over the past few years, there is sort of renewed interest. The commission obviously has allowed grantees to spend money over a longer period of time to help with expending all of their grant funds, but that this may also be an alternative that grantees are interested in. We want to be able to provide greater clarity for them and for staff in terms of assessing their requests. But historically, that's kind of been what's most common is debt service payments, even though there are all these other options under the guidelines. In the most recent budgeting period, I think we had one grantee approach us about purchasing a new building that they ultimately decided to hold off. It was not included in their budget, but these will be kind of recurring questions, I believe, now and potentially in the next few years.
Well, thanks for that. Really helpful. That was one of my first questions, is just how often does this happen? I guess I'll just ask one question and then see if others have questions. So would these rules apply equally to IOLTA funds and equal access funds, or is there a distinction between the two?
I think the distinction between the two is that, equal access fund has that requirement about using funds for an identified set of activities. And so to the extent that, they want to budget non-personnel expenditures, it would need to be tied to the EAF activities. So that would be a limitation on the use of EAF, whereas I think IOLTA would be more flexible.
Yeah, and to me, it just makes it more complicated. I think if this was allowed on EAF, I think in some ways because of the interest in those who budgeted those funds. So that's just something for us to think about. And Juan, you have a question, and then I'll let other people ask questions as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna agree with that. I mean, it's more theoretically lately, but so we don't have like a prohibition. I do think we probably should consider that though, because administration of that for judicial council, I don't know if they would appreciate that, even though there might not be a strict, and it hasn't come up because the increases have been for IOLTA, but I think that is a good reason to maybe be very clear that this might be just for IOLTA.
Yeah, I think that's right. Others have questions for Juan, Erica, Raul. Selena.
I'm happy to be on stack after commissioners if others have questions.
I'm not seeing any at the moment, so go ahead.
So I'm curious if you considered treating mortgage payments similar to rent, where just organizations that where you allocate a portion of your rent as part of your administrative cost, if you could allocate a similar amount as mortgage without it causing an increased administrative burdens. And the only time it would be triggered all this extra work is if they used it for a down payment, because it seems a little unfair to me that an organization that pays rent could allocate it, but an organization that pays mortgage would have to go through all this additional work, not only for them, but for staff as well.
I mean, we actually, that's exactly what we talked about. We did a brainstorming session, and that's kind of like where, I don't know our preference, but that's something that we thought would be easy to administer. Like if it's comparable, like, have to figure out the language, right? the mortgage payment is comparable to like the rent payment, like market value or whatever in that region, then that's fine. It doesn't trigger anything. I think that's easy to administer. The down payment is the tricky part. And then like the reversionary interest is something like I would say on the staff side, we haven't enforced, nor would we want to do that, being I don't know if we have the expertise to do all of that. It's a very right now convoluted policy. Raul did a really good job summarizing, but if you actually read the policy itself, it's not as clear as how Raul has laid it out.
Thanks, Selena and Dwan. Erica.
Thanks. So I appreciate all the questions that are in here, but I'm just curious, and Duan, you sort of started getting into this. Does staff have like suggestions on these? Do you think, I tend to think we should continue allowing debt service payments. I thought Selena's point about that is a very good one. But like, as far as raising the current threshold, there's inflation, so maybe we should, but also there's so I'm just kind of curious whether, and obviously we do. My goal is not to increase the administrative burden unnecessarily on staff. So just curious whether you guys I'm curious to hear if you have views on any of these that you want to share with us. And Raul, feel free to jump in as well, but just curious.
Erica, I think we were a proponent of it. I mean, that's what I was hearing in the room when we had our brainstorming session of having some policy that allowed the flexibility. I think the policy now is just very hard for us to enforce, and we haven't been, right. Like, we don't look at all those, reversionary interest. Half our staff don't know what that is. Like, we're just not like, not right now, we're not equipped to do it. So we want something that's easy to understand. We liked that the LSC had that 25,000 where you could do, we thought even maybe that could even be raised to 50,000, but of us flexibility, right, for programs and easy for us to administer, I think is the two common themes. But Erica, is that what you heard when we were?
Yeah, I would agree with them.
Other members have questions? Tammy, did you have a question?
No, I didn't have questions. I was going to ask similar to Erica, just in terms of staff preferences and kind of what their priorities would be.
So I know, it might like when I was the ED, we actually created a separate related corporation that purchased the building and then leased it back to us for space, which is how I think we then were able to claim the lease charges, right? Because it wasn't the legal services program as an entity. So I have no idea, I don't really remember how we worked that out with the bar, but it kind of goes to the same point I think that Selena made, which is whether you own a building or whether you're paying rent, there is a monthly cost related to your occupancy of the building. And we should find a way to make that work no matter what the legal structure might look at. So we did it in this particular way because we wanted it to be clear about that. So anyway, I guess I'm just agreeing that thinking through what that looks like would be helpful. I think the other question I have is there, at least as I read the memo and listened to the presentation, there's this, you can't lease any portion of it except to somebody who's another grantee. And I guess I'm trying to understand why that narrow of a exception makes sense. So an example is when we contemplated buying a building in Oakland, and it was going to be owned by 3 organizations, 2 of whom were LSC grantees, but one of whom was not, but was a legal organization. They just weren't a grantee of the state bar, which is how I hear this distinction being made. And do we actually care about who, it just seems like, at least if I'm understanding it, it seems like an odd restriction to me. You couldn't have another community-based organization who is aligned with the work that you're doing be a lessee in the building. am I misunderstanding what the memo says?
No, I think that's right, and I just like pointed out in a way that the Legal Services Corporation doesn't have similar restrictions, which suggests to me that the need for it may be sort of addressed in other ways. I think the idea behind the limitations is just to protect the funds and making sure they're used for a good purpose, and perhaps that can be addressed, by making sure that overall costs are still less for the grantee than if they were to rent. And so if that's true, I'm not sure we care as much if then someone else is receiving an incidental benefit from the property.
Yeah. I also agree with that. It just seemed like, I'm not sure why or how that came to be, but it also just seemed like a lot to sort of stay on top of in terms of what people were doing. Selena, you got a comment about that?
Oh yeah, I'm just agreeing that it seems like it would make sense if an organization were using like $300,000 for a down payment for real property, that they were going to then lease a storefront for, a corporation. But my nonprofit rents space from one of your grantees. We have 2 offices, and a lot of organizations are doing that now because they don't need their full office space, but they're not ready to sell the building if they're still figuring out their space needs. And I see it really frequently. Organizations will say, we have 2 offices. Is anyone interested in having space? So
Yeah. But it could be, it doesn't, I mean, I guess also the point is, it, to my thinking, doesn't have to be someone who's eligible for IOLTA funds, which is, a total of 100, whatever the number is, 115 grantees. There's other people providing legal services, and there's people that are aligned with the mission of the organization that could be good to have too. So Erica Connolly.
Thanks. Yeah, I just kind of going back, I guess one of the things, it sounds like, is the sort of, do we think LSC's policy is overall better? Like, do we think we want to align with their policy? Or are there things that their policy does that we don't think are as useful? I just say that because we've used them as a bench, or I guess as a comparison. And it seems like there's some ways in which they're more flexible and some ways in which they're, a little more restrictive. So I'm just kind of curious, and also whether there is any kind of administrative benefit to grantees if we fully aligned with LSC, or where there's places that we might want to depart.
I mean, so I think those are fair questions to ask. I'm probably in maybe there's some things that work better there, but there's certainly things that work better in the way we currently have it drafted. And I'm probably inclined to say, what would actually work as a sensible set of rules for California, right? Not, and adjust to LSC. I mean, the LSC rules, I think, benefit 12 out of the 115 programs, because that's what they would have to comply with. But so currently, like roughly 10% of the programs, and the rest of the programs don't receive LSC funds. So it's not really alignment. And I think that as we've added grantees, the percentage has gone down, right, of LSC programs. So I guess the other thing is, I was trying to think of like, well, where else does like the state bar maintain an interest in how grantees spend their funds? And I may be remembering this incorrectly, but if we used IOLTA to bring a case challenging what the state was doing, and we ultimately got attorney's fees for that work, I think that counts as program income essentially for that, and we have to report that income to the state bar, right? And I'm just trying to understand so for how long could something be program income, right? And that the state bar would want to make sure that it knew that those funds were being spent in a way that benefited the client group that they were brought on behalf of, meaning indigent Californians, right? And is there any comparison with how that's done to what should or happen or in real property, or are they really just two different things?
I mean, I think that's an interesting point, and I think where we can have parallels, that's easy again for grantees to kind of understand the rationale and that we're enforcing like generally the same kind of buckets, but we do on in terms of like if there's like a case and there's like fees that come back that the money originated from us, the expectation is that the programs need to spend it on qualifying services and for qualifying clients, right? When we go on monitoring visits, we check for that. So if here, if there's a corollary, they're making money off of like, you know, um, these kind of either leasing back or something related to their real property or the sell, then I think it's not unreasonable to have that expectation. The other topic that we're doing this year is we're going to do give guidance on investment policy, not just for our money, but for grantees, how they can invest our. So I can see that's an area also that might be in that bucket of like if they're receiving some financial benefit from the use of our funds, what then happens with that and how do we monitor for that?
Yeah, I get, that was, yeah, perfect, because that was kind of the
Mhm.
second part of my question. So
Yeah.
like, we got attorney's fees
Mhm.
and we were keeping them because we weren't spending all of them in the year in which they were received. They could earn interest essentially, right? And we always understood that that interest earned then was treated the same as the originating attorney's fees, right?
Yes.
So if we earned, you know, I don't know, $1,000 on the 100,000 we had, whatever it was, right? Then that would be 101,000 that we then had to spend for that purpose. And so I think just thinking about parallels and what does that mean for this is something worth thinking about. And I'm not trying to say that should change the period of time that the bar has an interest in the building, but what happens during that period of time, like, anyway, I think that's interesting. We haven't really talked about, do we agree with the bar after 5 years? First of all, I think there should just, whatever the rule is, there should be a rule about it. This notion that people could change earlier just seems like a nightmare to try and figure out. Like to Raul's point, like if somebody had the option of saying at the end of 3 years, we think we've already had the equivalent of the bar's interest taken care of as it would have been in 5 years, that just seems like way too much work to administer, and even for anybody to understand what that criteria look like, and kind of just sets it up, I think, for disagreements between grantees and the state bar. So whatever the period of time is, and I don't know whether the staff has or Selena has opinions about, is 5 years reasonable or should it be some other period of time?
Well, can I ask a baseline question? Because I do think I'm hearing a little bit consensus around, debt payment, that's fine, mortgage payments, and then we'll figure out, the market value, all that stuff. I think that can be researched and we can give you, I think that the piece that we'd like a little bit more guidance, because I don't think the staff have a real opinion, is the down payment. Because I think the down payment is where then you might then have, retain some interest when you sell the building. That's where all the trickiness. So maybe we can have a little bit discussion on that to give us a little, that's the piece that I think we need a lot of guidance on.
People have thoughts about?
My only thought on that is I remember in 2020 when a lot of organizations wanted to pay down their mortgages, basically, not necessarily buy new, but they're like, can we put 100,000 on our mortgage? Do you anticipate this to be a bigger issue moving forward? How common do you think it will be, specifically on down payment or like, paying down the principal outside of a monthly mortgage? And the reason why I'm asking is because I anticipate this is a lot of staff work. And so if it's tracking for like 2 grantees, maybe it's not so bad. But if you're anticipating this is tracking it for 10 grantees, it does feel like a lot more work for you to track for 5 years.
I don't think it's high volume, but I think it comes up. And I have to say our lack of clarity around like how to even enforce this rule, I think probably deterred programs from, that's my take, Erica, I don't know if that's your take.
That's what I was going to say.
Deterred programs from like trying to do it. So if this is actually something that, we want, we should have very clear, and then, we'll hold, and then that might actually encourage if that's what we want. But right now, nobody really understands the rules. So I think they're just like, what are you even asking for? Because we actually ask for a lot of information. And it's just like a little bit of a, and we, to be honest, we don't have a great mechanism to review it because it's just the policy is just very convoluted. It's very hard to understand. So that's why I'm saying if the commission this is something that we want to support, we should have better guidance, and that actually will probably generate more. But right now, it's very low volume.
So it seemed like Selena raised like a variation. So there's the down payment. And what should happen with the down payment? And how do you evaluate an ongoing interest, or what period of time for an interest with a down payment? So 200,000 or 500,000 or whatever it is. And then there's increasing your the amount that you owe by making an investment of 100,000 in a year. So you're essentially paying down your debt. And is like, I think we're clear, as you said, Dwan, that if it's about you're making a mortgage payment that is comparable to your fair market rental rate, then like, why does the bar care about that? It should kind of be treated the same, but that standard might not apply if you're essentially paying 100,000. And so then how to account for that 100,000, and does that increase the bar's interest in the property in any way, right? That would have to be tracked. So it could be and I guess there's the outstanding question that will go to Erica of, what if you made significant capital improvements to the building? So DRC made, one of the things that was important to us is that we had a fully accessible elevator. And I can tell you that elevators are actually really expensive, like hundreds of thousands of dollars. But we didn't use state bar funds for it, but it was, something. So with that, if we had used state bar funds to make that capital improvement, how does that get accounted for? So there's sort of three different ways, I think, that we have to sort of just noodle through, or ask staff to think about, or we could have a couple of people here help you think about, right? In kind of a working group. And Erica, you had a comment.
Yeah, I think I just have a sort of very essential, like big picture question, which is like, do we want to actually maintain an interest regardless of the size of the payment? Like, I understand LSC does it and we do it now for this amortization period. But I'm not saying that we shouldn't. I'm just posing it as like, if we don't want to have an interest in the property at all, then actually a lot of this administrative stuff kind of goes away, right? We just basically say, so long as you're using our funds, you provided, certain services. I guess I want to just talk through a little bit about what is the benefit of actually having a property, like a security interest, and, whether we want to, I understand the sort of concept of like having some increased control, but
it's,
then you start to get into like, why is 100,000 in 1 year different than 100,000 over 5 years, right? Like, then you start to get into like, well, if it's just about, hey, we want to like, make sure that you're using whatever equity you're building in the building for indigent services. Anyway, I'm just posing this as like a broader question about whether we want that or not.
When I think that was why I asked the earlier question of, when you get attorney's fees, the bar does monitor to make sure that you are using those fees for the benefit of indigent people. And like, so we do it there. Is there a similar consideration for an interest in a building that's going to continue to be used for the benefit of indigent people? Because you could get $100,000 in attorney's fees, and you could spend essentially $100,000 of bar money, right, for something you're doing with your building, and doesn't matter which one it is, I guess. And Jonathan, you had your hand up.
Yeah. So is there a need to have a security interest in case something happens with the grantee and the commission needs to step in to have a hand in resolving something? I mean, what would happen if there was some sort of malfeasance and then it got to the public and it was made known that funds were used um, through a grant from the commission to either pay down a mortgage or cover something. So isn't it important for that reason?
So when I do think that's the idea. The security interest is the like primary enforcement mechanism here to ensure it's like in the policy it's spelled out. It serves to ensure that the grant proceeds are used for permissible uses. I just want to add that the preamble in the policy specifically states that funds are not supposed to be used for investment purposes, which is perhaps where some of this is coming from, right? Like you could put 100,000 toward a purchase, and if we don't have some kind of period of ensuring that it's used for proper purposes, someone could then like turn around and sell it and reap it as like an investment profit, and then it wouldn't be subject to restrictions.
And I guess the other question is more so related to a programmatic issue. So if grantees are leveraging this to either pay off a mortgage or pay down a mortgage, are they then required to use funds that would have been otherwise paid for the mortgage to do other grant-related work or other programmatic work? Do we get involved in that?
So I'm not sure I understood the
Yeah,
question.
you
Want to
restate it.
maybe
Sure. So I guess what I'm saying is, if a grantee is using funds to pay down a mortgage, they're obviously getting other grant funds from other organizations as well. So do we then say, because you're receiving these funds to pay down this mortgage or to buy a building, the funds that you would have otherwise, that money should be replaced by another organization to do programmatic related work?
so as I hear that question, and then I might be wrong. So like for my prior organization, when we made rent payments, we had an accounting procedure that said X percentage was chargeable to the state bar, X percentage to these other 12 grants. So everybody paid their pro rata share. And we would treat a mortgage payment in that same way, right? So that we weren't just saying the state bar is fully paying the mortgage and everybody else that worked for the organization got the benefit of that. It had, so there was sort of a accounting for that. So I can't speak to, I mean, I think generally there's an expectation that your administrative costs have a way in which it's being proportionate to the funds than the staff that are working under different funds. And maybe that needs to be clear in this so that you're not just paying a mortgage and using only state bar funds. So I think that's what you're asking. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Tuan.
I was gonna say, underlying your question, Jonathan, I think that's like maybe the heart of the policy question, because if we don't allow, say, the purchase of, capital or down payment, that money will be used in a different way, right? Does the commission want to incentivize using it for what we call maybe more traditional to deliver services more directly, right? So that's like, because if they're not allowed to budget it this way, then they will budget another way, right? So what are we trying to incentivize? What are we trying to encourage? What at the end of the day is going to like increase services like overall, right? Is having a building with an elevator. Is that, I think part of it is a values judgment, and this is like the piece I think that's like difficult, right? I would say personally, like, right, we have a lot of trust in our programs for them to kind of budget and know how best to kind of use their funding and do all that. There's suggested guidelines, right? This intersects with some of our other policies and our fiscal team is doing around like indirect costs and like admin versus non-admin. So maybe we get at that way and we're flexible here. I actually don't, this is why this topic is actually very difficult for us, because I think it's just like philosophically is really hard, and then it's hard to like then administer. That's why I wanted to have at least a preliminary conversation to get some guidance from you. But I do think, like, again, underlying your question, that might be like the heart of the question here is like, how much do you want to allow, the purchase of building versus like that money to go towards, again, more direct services for clients?
Erica.
Yeah. So on that point, like I am of the view that we should actually encourage organizations to spend this money in that way. I think that that kind of infrastructure is actually really important for financial stability for the organizations. There are so many funds that are so many grants that don't allow that if we have that flexibility, I actually think it's quite helpful. And then I think there can be other trickle down, you know, sorry, that's a dangerous phrase, but if you own your building or you've paid down your mortgage, you might be more comfortable raising salaries, right? Because you're less concerned about, an APR or something like that going up or something like that. So I very much want to encourage that they do this. To me, it's just a matter of like, how do we both safeguard ourselves and make sure people are doing it in a way that's like appropriate while not making it a huge headache for everyone involved. And unfortunately, I don't know enough about amortization and real property and like deeds to like be able to say in this moment, like, here's the great plan. And I don't know whether we pick 5 years or it sounds as if maybe we're not leaning towards a perpetual security interest. Not sure anyone really wants to do that. The reason I was sort of challenging the security interest is because it sounded as if there's sort of this point that like the enforcement mechanism was a really heavy one, right? Like the only way to do it is to force a sale. Like you're foreclosing essentially on a building, which doesn't seem very promising either. So I wonder whether that's why I was sort of poking at this security interest idea in general. Is like, is there a better way to get at the issue that we're trying to ensure here than maybe a security? And maybe there isn't. Security interest is pretty easy in some ways, but just raising some points. But I do want to encourage capital expenditures, all that stuff. I think it's great. I think it's an investment in our organizations.
Javier.
Yeah, I echo from a financial standpoint, like it's exponential, right? Like that's the cool thing about it. It's like because it's not programmatic expense for like an individual or a group of individuals, like it facilitates a lot more. That makes a ton of sense and it's really cool. I don't know if I have ideas on like the back end to what you were just saying, Erica, of like because that is very punitive and also very messy. It's like I've worked tangentially, I've not done like real estate credit work, but have worked with companies that have gone through stuff and like it's messy all around. So I don't even know if is there something on the front end? Like, are there qualifications to like consider? And I don't know if this like involves the eligibility committee or anything like that, but like for this to be available to organizations that have a little bit more of like a track record of like fulfilling requirements, using funds for programs, because then we can be more confident that like they get access to this vehicle. They're not gonna like do shenanigans with. So maybe that's an approach.
Yeah. Selena.
I know there'll be more work done on this topic. So one of my questions is whether it would be treated differently if the organization were proposing to use some of their allocated administrative cost up to the cap already allowed for a down payment. So they were underutilizing their administrative percentage and they were able to use it there. So if it would be treated differently if it were a small within the threshold than if it were above the threshold, because maybe that's another distinction, because paying whatever, $30,000 down for a down payment is really different than paying like $2 million down. But to Erica's point earlier, Erica Connolly's point, a lot of organizations, when they tell their narrative of why they need to buy a building, oftentimes, because I've attended meetings where they talk about this, they're trying to have a storefront or a brick and mortar office in a community that has difficulties accessing their downtown office. So there's usually a programmatic reason why they need to buy space. And so I think that, I feel like many commissioners would find that very compelling if they can't afford rent, but ironically, they can afford a building in particular regions. So I know there's going to be more work to be done, but I thought that might be a helpful framing too.
Thank you for that, Tuan.
Yeah, and Eric, I agree with your the policy stance of trying to encourage for infrastructure. I want to raise one thing, and I don't actually have a good solution to it, but there's this equity too, right? Because generally, it's our bigger programs, our more financially secure programs that are able to even think about or consider purchasing property. And so, if we allow that, I do think I think we're moving in the direction of allowing it, but that down payment thing is still a little bit difficult for me. And how do we do that? Because if they, and maybe that's amortization period can help, because if it's a smaller period where they can amortize that, they can, I think, claim that those expenses towards as their qualified expenditures. I don't know if that's right, Erica. Erica, if that's what we would do, but then their award is higher. So it does then privilege, if you're well-resourced and bigger, this ability to get a bigger award because of that. I just raise it. It's not.
So that because they're counting, so just walk through. So you're saying essentially the amount they're paying down their debt counts as an expenditure.
Yes.
But if that would not be more than their lease, why do we care?
I think it's the down payment part, or I was hearing Selena, and I think you're right, Selena. There probably were a couple programs that wanted to pay down their principal more, so it wasn't just their monthly mortgage. They wanted to pay an additional 200,000, right, 100,000. And Erica, you let me know how this works. Do we then amortize it then, or we don't let them claim? Say it's $200,000. Could they claim it that year, or is that then spread out through that 5 year? How does that work?
Currently, the instructions on the application are for grantees to back out any expenditures on capital additions.
Okay, so maybe that's the solution then.
Which actually makes sense, I think, if you're trying not to sort of get the advantage of it, right?
Yeah. Okay, so that makes sense. So we thought through, great.
So good question, and something that appears to already be solved. Okay, I want to be mindful of our time, so I think we sort of allocated till 1:30 for this, and see if other people had other comments, and then talk a little bit about maybe next steps, so that I feel like, there's sort of this emerging, it's a good policy to allow this to happen. There are details about and maybe we're saying it's good for IOLTA. It shouldn't be allowed with other funds that the bar receives, because that just adds complexity to it. So equal access or homeless prevention or whatever else they might be, right? So that's another seeming guidepost. It seems like the questions that are emerging are really about the down payment and and paying down the mortgage, right? As the things that seem more complicated, maybe partly answered by those can't be included on your qualifying expenses for the year. So it's a way to make sure you're not getting an additional amount. I guess we could also think about is there a cap on the amount of your grant that you could spend for that? I think that goes in some ways to Jonathan's question, right? Of an extreme example would be, we would not want a program spending their entire IOLTA grant to buy a building. So should we think about some percentage that could be used for a down payment? I haven't really thought this through. I'm just trying to listen to what people have said. You still should be using our money to provide direct legal services, and it's not gonna look great if you spent your entire grant buying a building and we have no data to report about who you actually served in a year, right? Anyway, I think those are like, it feels like, and maybe there's an interest still in maintaining an interest in the building for a period of time. I didn't actually hear anybody talk to maintaining a interest in the building for the perpetuity of the organization, because that seemed like complicated by just being able to track it over that period of time. So maybe not for that. People have anything else we think should go into the mix of this?
It-
Go ahead, Erica.
Just the only other thing I'd say is it sounds as if there's consensus that mortgage payments can be treated as rent
You're
sort
right.
of immediately, not after a 5-year period without sort of an ongoing interest. It seems as if
Yeah, I think
the
mortgage
committee
payments,
is in agreement with that. Yeah,
yeah, I think
regular,
that
like
are
that are comparable.
comparable, right,
Yeah,
to what you would pay in a
your,
rental or a lease payment. Mhm.
yeah, your standard mortgage payment, not paying down principal in
That's why I
addition.
think I just did it a different way,
Yeah.
which is pull out the
Yeah.
harder questions are the down payment and paying additional amounts towards the principal. And it seems like people are fine allowing that, but we need to think through, like, what's the way that can efficiently be done? And does the bar want any interest in that? And we didn't really talk about capital improvements, because like a $250,000 elevator, which is what an elevator cost 5 years ago, or whatever, 10 years, a lot of money. Is that the same as a capital expenditure as something else? And do we have rules about how we treat that capital expenditure that could be helpful?
Yeah, I think the policy is silent on that. Whereas the LSC treats it as a purchase of property, and so it adds to the interest they have in the property.
I mean, I tend to think it would not, partly for administrative reasons, would not be beneficial for us to take an interest in a capital expenditure. I will note, I think capital expenditures you can add to your basis in real property. So it sort of, can have tax implications for you if you dispose of the property later, but I'm not sure that's something we need to like be digging into like longer term or anything like that.
Heidi, were you?
Also, how are you gonna like foreclose on an elevator? Sorry, I was just trying to like the
I don't know
enforcement
that I
mechanism
even I mean, maybe that's a question, and then I think Heidi might have joined because she had some wisdom for us, but I'm not sure about the only way I guess there's this outstanding question about the only way the bar could enforce something would be to essentially force a sale. So what would the bar want to be enforcing about the building? Like they weren't using it for the allowed purposes? Is that what we're thinking?
I don't think we want to, right?
I
So
know,
like,
I
I think
got,
that's
but
part of,
like,
yeah,
we have
that's,
this rule that
yeah, yeah.
says like, it was in the memo, kind of like, and I guess I was just trying to, I mean, that sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah.
So
No, it does, yeah.
maybe if the interest continues to be for the limited period of time, or maybe like, I don't know, then I think it's not like it's gonna be for, I don't think anybody's speaking to maintaining an interest for the, like LSC does, right? So anyway, Heidi, did you have a comment?
Sorry, I just before Heidi comments, I think Tammy's been trying to
Oh, sorry.
jump in
I'm
for
so
a while.
sorry.
So
No, nothing substantial, just really like this is a good discussion. I think there's a lot to consider, and I was just going to volunteer to be on a working group if we if
Yeah,
you talk
that'd
about
be great.
kind of smaller breakouts where we can take these into like individual components, because it is a lot. There's a lot to consider here, and when you think about the flexibility of the program and then the administrative burden that we need to consider, and then protecting the bar, there's a lot to consider in these decisions. So I think it's a great dialogue.
Yeah, I think that might be the best solution, is to have a smaller group, like now that we've gotten feedback, kind of wrestle with it. Okay, Heidi.
I just wanted to speak to the expenditure question, whether it counts as a down payment and mortgage payments count as an expenditure in the eyes of the state bar. They show up in a different section of audits, that it would reductions that are debt payments go in, it reduces a payable, and down payments go to a capital expenses. Those don't show up in the annual expenditure, so they would not be counted. You wouldn't be double counting those because they don't show up in the place that we get the expenditures from on organizations' audits.
Yeah, so I think what Erica said in a different way was that you don't get to claim those as a qualified expenditure, right?
Yeah, you can't. They're not on the expense sheet, so we would
Yeah.
not that we tie their
Yeah.
their qualified expenditures to, so they never show up as part of that equation.
Yeah, I think we understood that, not the detail, like why that happened, so thank you for that. But we understood that that wasn't gonna be a problem for that, to create an inequity with people that had larger grants, and then we're gonna benefit in that way from being able to count that, so that's great to know. Okay, so agreement to have a small working group to help flesh this out more. Does that make sense for staff? Yes,
I think we can organize that.
I'm happy to join Tammy if that's helpful.
Thank you.
Okay, any last words on this? Thanks for the good presentation. I thought it was really helpful, and the questions, and people asked really good questions, I thought. So thanks for everyone participating in the discussion. Okay, any last words? Okay, I think we don't have any last words, so we'll go back to our agenda, which takes us to the discussion regarding the Rules Committee Charter. And Erica, do you want to start with this? I mean, I guess we'll say we all know that this was approved at the last commission meeting along with all the other charters. Our meeting got postponed, and so people didn't have the chance, except as a full commissioner, to look at it. Although I think, as Erica has observed, and Dwan, this is kind of the one committee whose purpose didn't really change, because the work we're doing is just what the work the Rules Committee has always done, and the changes that were included are changes that applied to sort of have that consistency among the rules. But with that, let's just quickly go through it and see if there's any questions or comments.
So, yes, I think as Catherine summarized, in terms of the Rules Committee being a continuing committee, I think most folks are kind of aware of the purpose and role in terms of creating a comprehensive framework of rules governing grants administration to ensure transparency, efficiency, and clarity for all participants. Felt that this is consistent, kind of what the committee has been doing all along these past few years, and will continue to do this year and in the future. I think, as you all know, the membership information, it just like every other committee, members are appointed by the chair or co-chairs, and then the chair of this committee is selected also by the co-chairs. We'll be meeting, this year we'll be meeting 4 times a year, but the frequency could be up to 6 times a year as needed. The authority and responsibilities, again, were intended to reflect what has already been happening in terms of developing recommendations, having these discussions like we just did on the real property purchases piece, making specific recommendations to revisions of rules or creating new rules as necessary, coordinating with other committees. So to the extent that, anybody, for example, who's been on eligibility and budget review probably knows that there have been topics that have come up in that committee in the past that then grew into a larger topic that was addressed by this committee, things like budget revisions and carryovers, for example. So to the extent that that happens or may continue to happen, it would be appropriate to kind of alert staff, and we can bring it to the committee to look into as needed. And then a really important aspect of the committee's work is getting stakeholder feedback. And so as we move forward with our topics this year, we'll be reaching out to LAC and grantees directly and seeking that input before proposing or moving forward with any kind of final recommendations. So we just wanted to present it again to the extent that anybody had questions about the charter or any comments on it, knowing that it has been approved, but just wanted to make sure that there was an opportunity for discussion as needed.
Any comments or questions? Okay, I think we're good, and we all looked at it a week ago, so that's probably handy. And I think as we go through our work this year, if there's something that emerges that says we need to change something, then we can certainly talk to the staff about it and then think about whether the charter needs to change, or it's just developing a common understanding about what something means. So I don't think nothing is really written in concrete, so we can make adjustments as we need to. Okay. I think that takes us to the work plan, which I think you have all seen before, and staff has done a great job of identifying commission members who are on the various topics we're taking up. One of the things I liked about this work plan is it actually is also historical document of the work that we've done and the rules and where those are. So it's actually a good resource. And is there a way to make it? Wait, you know what?
Oh, sure. Zoom in a little bit.
I can do it. I can shrink other. There. I did it for myself.
Yeah, as Catherine mentioned, the work plan does include sort of the history since the inception of the Rules Committee for the past few years. And it's exciting to see how many topics have been covered and sort of resolved, and some that are still in process, but that we're hoping to kind of move forward through public comment and finalization this year. If you had a chance to look at it, the topics for this year, it looks like a lot of topics, but it's actually probably about 6 topics that we'll be tackling in 2025. We're just taking a slightly different approach in terms of, for some of the larger or more complicated topics, having more preliminary discussions about them. So we'll be revisiting some of these a few times throughout the year. Support centers being one example that we'll be talking about them initially in May, but not really moving to try to finalize anything until later in the year, because there are so many subtopics that fall under that heading. And the other thing you might—
Can I just ask a question before you go on? For the real property, so I think initially we thought there might be a rule for discussion, but we ended up having kind of the good discussion today in advance of that. So is the intention to bring that back to the Rules Committee on May 2nd, right?
Yeah, so I'll have to update this work plan
it's not
again, but yes, the intention is to bring it back with something more concrete. And then I think depending on that working group's perception, if we think that May is sufficient time to kind of get a proposed rule out, then we can do that in May. If not, then I think the August meeting would be
right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a good point that this is sort of a living document, and so we probably will be updating it periodically throughout the year. But just to give you an idea, kind of at this point in time, we wanted to share it with you and go over it. I think the other thing you'll notice about this work plan is that most of the topics this year sort of are fiscal in nature, with the large exception being support centers. And I think all the work that's been done on fiscal topics in the past year helped kind of generate these current topics. And the other thing that seems to be a feature in my experience so far with the topics this year, is that we're also seeing a narrowing of topics. That, we started out with much broader topics in prior years, and now we're kind of getting to some kind of fine tuning or more specificity with the topics. So what you'll anticipate at the next meeting is we'll talk about sports centers and monitoring, kind of anything related to monitoring issues, and then potentially the real property purchases if they are ready at that time.
Yeah, and Kim T sent out a request for the support center topic earlier today for trying to set up dates. So I think that one seems underway.
Yeah. And I know that we distributed this work plan a number of weeks ago, but if anybody has questions or concerns about the working groups that you've been assigned to thus far, please don't hesitate to reach out to me about them. And I want to say that in terms of the topics that are coming up, like staff has already been meeting on a number of them already internally to kind of prepare for our working group meetings. So we've talked about the investment policy and support centers and monitoring internally already. And so we are looking forward to scheduling those meetings with working groups, particularly the monitoring and support centers in the next few weeks, to start getting your feedback there. I think, as I mentioned before, if anything new comes up that you hear either through other commission activities that you think should be considered to be added to the Rules Committee work plan, please also bring that up. Yes, Joanne.
Just because I see a 300%, the FPL.
Yeah.
I think I shared this with Erica because,
yeah.
Selena has been doing some work around this. She's convened some working groups or conferred with some people. And I think that one we would like to suggest to kind of hold off till next year. There's a lot going on this year with the advocacy, and we don't quite have consensus yet. And so I think it is better to maybe defer to 2026. That's okay with the committee.
I think it's fine. The only thing I think it's fine. And I think there continues to be legislative interest in some kind of increase this year. I don't even know that I can say I think it's possible because nobody knows what the budget's going to look like. So I think it's just to know there's people outside of us that are talking about it, although they're generally operating from a place of whatever percent. I thought if you're increasing it by X percentage, the number of eligible people, it should result in an corresponding increase in funding. So that's, I guess, that's just what I'm hearing. So
one option is also to do research outside of like the rules committee space. And then if that's something like, where like it's the staff that's working on that, or, Erica and I have been familiar with doing the increases and stuff for the other codification topic. We're happy to contribute where we can, or we can leave it on the work plan and have the discussion, but then maybe not vote on something. I mean, that's another option.
Maybe it's just there even as an information item to say what's happening and is there a reason to do something?
Yeah. Oh, so maybe we keep it then. I think that's good.
Sure.
And just adding a little bit extra information there, I think that largely the concern I heard from programs, but a lot of programs really love the idea of increasing it to 300%. And those that did have concerns were worried about losses in federal funding and the increase in need and just general loss in funding around the same time, that they felt some nervousness about increasing the potential client pool if there were not also an increase in funds. So I do think it would be helpful just to crunch the numbers on the total amount of expenditures, largely with the QLSPs, the total amount of expenditures, which maybe is like 600 million. And then like, what does it mean if we serve the same percentage of eligible clients? Would that increase? Because I want to say that from 200% to 300% of the federal poverty, it's something like a 25 to 40% increase in clients. So
yeah, I think I sent you the number and you had already pulled it. I don't have it. I mean, we can do that. We won't do a memo, but what we'll do is an informational presentation with that type of number. Like if you increase it, how many clients are we talking about? Like in terms of if we yeah, so we could do all that, package it.
And at least anecdotally, from what I've heard from a lot of organizations, with the higher income, potentially eligible, future clients, a lot of that would be brief services. It wouldn't be full scope representation. It's just being able to count a lot of the work that they may be doing through brief advice. So the math may not work out exactly, but just acknowledging that with an increase in clients, we would hope to see an increase in funds, but it may be a really complicated picture if they're mostly helping them through brief services.
I also think there's the possibility of targeting some issues such as disaster relief. We had the presentation about that, and another is just sort of what's come up with some specified populations such as trans individuals. That is an interest of the chair of the budget committee on the Senate side. So anyway, I just think there's lots of things. It'd just be good to have an information item, even if we're not proposing a rule change, I think.
Sure. Yeah, and we'll put together stuff, and Catherine will work with you to see if you want to pull more data before we bring it to the committee then.
And I think showing us, which I'm sure you would do, is like what is the income level at 300%, right? So that people can actually
Yes.
see that. Perfect. Thank you. Back to you, Erica. Anything else on this?
I think that's it on the work plan, again, unless folks have questions or any other comments about some of the topics.
Anybody have questions about where they're assigned and when those meetings are happening? It looks like kind of the next tranche of things starting at 25 doesn't go until the August meeting. So we have sort of it actually makes me feel better when it's sort of like, here's what you're dealing with in May, and then here's the group of things in August, just as a way of not having quite as much to think about at each meeting. Erica.
So I just had a quick question, as we're having worked on a lot of fiscal stuff, and this may be something that Heidi may also need to fill in, is I know at some point we were like working on a bunch of the rules and then we were sort of going to bundle them together. And I'm just curious, it's been a while, so I'm just not sure what the status of that is.
Yeah.
Whether we're sort of there's still going to be a package that goes to the full commission, or there's more work. Just trying to get a sense of like where we're at on that part.
Yeah, those that have already gone through rules committee, we're hoping to put them out for public comment, put them on the commission's agenda for May for them to go out for public comment.
Great.
Yep.
Sorry, that is probably in that spreadsheet and I just didn't review it carefully. Sorry.
No, that's fine. And yeah, putting all those rules together, it was like 16 pages of rule changes. So yeah, so it's great.
But we
work.
thought about
That's
them
been,
really
yeah.
carefully.
Yes, no, that's
it's like
yeah,
a year and a half of work.
Exactly. So yes, we're hoping to release those all together, as was the intent, to make sure that, one rule change here is not going to have unintended consequences elsewhere. So I think that's been achieved. And so we're, just hoping to put those out soon.
I mean, I have a glass of champagne when those finally get approved. I'm very proud of myself and the various people on the fiscal committee or working group.
Okay, other questions or comments? Okay, I think then we have reached the end of our agenda in record time. So thanks to Erica and all the other bar staff for putting all that together. If there's any other last comments from anyone? Not seeing any. Okay, we will consider the meeting to be adjourned. I think I gather from the annotation, we do not need a motion to do that. So we can just say we're adjourning and we are done with our agenda for today. So thanks everyone for the terrific participation. And our next meeting is on Friday, May 2nd. And I believe Kimberly, being the very efficient person she is, has already sent out all of those appointment slips. So that's really helpful. So thanks for that, Kimberly. Okay, see everyone later.
Thank
Bye.
you.